Hi there, my name's Kelly, and just in case you didn't see any of my previous videos, in 2020 my 11-year-old daughter was diagnosed with anorexia. As parents, my husband and I, we did everything we could to try and help my daughter, but by the time that we received the help, she was very, very sick. In 2021, she, as a 12-year-old, she was admitted into hospital for the first time, which is what I want to talk to you about today. So if you wanted to hear about our journey from where we went from diagnosis or from the signs and symptoms of her starting to have her eating disorder to when we actually got support or our first hospital admission, go and have a look on my channel because there is a video detailing that, and it has loads of great tips and tricks and just our experience about what you can look out for if you think that someone that you might know has an eating disorder. It was just our journey, but hopefully it can help other people identify it early enough to get some support early enough for you as well. In about March 2021, my daughter got to the point with her eating disorder with anorexia after being diagnosed in October the previous year. By March, she was unable to stand up without feeling dizzy and losing her eyesight. And no matter what we did, we could not get her to eat more than one meal a day at most. And I think at that stage it was breakfast, the meal that she was eating. And I think she might have been eating 1 or 2 Wheat Bix or something like that. But that was the only thing that she would eat in the entire day. And this was despite me having done an eating disorder course and having all of the knowledge. There was simply zero we could do to get her to eat. She was just too unwell. We'd already been told by the eating disorder service at the Children's Hospital at that stage that she wasn't sick enough to go on their waiting list. And after a lot of crying and hysterica and crazy mama from me, they relented and let her stay on the list a little bit longer until we knew how she was going. So at this stage, we were visiting the GP every second day due to her being medically unstable. And medically unstable means that there are some things about her body that weren't operating in the way that they should have been operating in. So at that stage, her heart wasn't doing what it needed to be doing. Her blood pressure wasn't doing what it needed to be doing. Her heart rate wasn't doing what it needed to be doing. And her blood sugar levels weren't. But it still wasn't enough to get her admitted into hospital. All it meant is that she had to be on bed rest, complete bed rest, no activity, or anything like that. And pretty much my GP and I were just playing the waiting game until she got unwell enough to go into hospital because nothing we did could help her eat. So eventually the GP told us to take her to the hospital because we were that worried about her, particularly when not being able to stand up and feeling like passing out and things like that. But we were told at the time that they may just send us straight home because there's a lot of kids with eating disorders and not enough help around or not enough beds available. So we went home, packed all of our things just in case we were going to be admitted because the hospital is an hour away, the Children's Hospital from us. And when we arrived at the hospital, we had a bit of a wait in the waiting room and then we were taken through for assessment. During the assessment, they found, again, this whole time I'm just like a nervous wreck because I'm like, if they do not admit her, she is so unwell. If she doesn't get the help she needs now, I just don't know what I'm going to do. It was horrendous. It was a horrendous time. So during the assessment, they found again that her heart rate and blood pressure were not doing what they were meant to be doing, and her blood sugar levels were dangerously low. So they did their best to get her to eat, but they at the hospital had the same luck as my husband and I. She wasn't going to eat. You know, she was too far down this path of anorexia. And when I do a video on the effects on the brain of anorexia, you can see why, you know, there's almost nothing you can do at that point in time to get them to eat, or you can't rationalize them with them that at that point in time they're too sick. All you can do is try and keep them alive until you can get some support. So we had this very lovely male nurse who was very familiar with eating disorders, and I think he worked some of the time in the emergency department, but also some of the time up on the eating disorder ward or the adolescent ward. And he explained to me that my daughter would need to be admitted for a 3-day continuous feed, a feeding program through a nasogastric tube. So, and then we would probably go home after that if she was medically stable. So we stayed overnight in the emergency department because there wasn't any beds on the ward. And that is quite a common case at our local children's hospital. We stayed there, and the next morning we were taken up to the toddler ward, or I don't know what they officially call it, but it's the ward with the very small, the ward with the very small children in it. And she was connected to a nasogastric tube, and then had a lot of bags of high energy formula started. And I suppose for me, when I was planning out this video and when I talked to you about it, I probably talked to you about it in quite a clinical way because I've been so exposed to it through her journey. I will say that when I first saw my daughter having to have a nasogastric tube inserted into her, and a feed bag go up, there's nothing, it's very distressing at the time. It's not a distressing process. It's a distressing thing as a parent to recognize that your child is that sick. And if they don't get the help that they need, then they will die. There's only one way out of anorexia if you don't get the help that you need. So she had the nasogastric tube connected. She was getting the food, the high energy formula through the bag that they had held up there. And she would have this for 3 days and 3 nights. It would just continually being replaced. Once it's empty, another bag gets put in and they're getting nourished 24/7. She felt so sick during that process that it was really challenging as a parent to kind of know that she needed to keep going with this, because they are genuinely very, very nauseous by this stage. They're that sick. They're not used to having a lot of food or anything in their stomach, and it does make them feel sick. But it's part of the deterrent as well of them having to go through this again, is the fact that it is awful and uncomfortable and disgusting for them. She was also mortified at all the calories that she was consuming. So by then, and I didn't realize this, that by then my daughter had become very good at calorie counting and estimating. I didn't know that she knew off by heart calories of many, many foods. When I think of a person with an eating disorder, I think of a certain type of person, and that was before my own daughter had one. And now that I know what it's like, I'm like, wow. Sometimes you can think that my daughter would never be like that. She would never count those calories. She would never be pacing in a room. She would never be doing the exercise into the early hours of the morning. And you think that it never would happen to you. But when an eating disorder really opens your eyes on how it can take a perfectly normal, rational human being and turn them into someone that is so, so unwell that you don't even recognize who they are. So, when they have a nasogastric tube inserted, they have the bag up there. They then put a pillowcase on it, and they're attached to that for the 3 days. They can't come off it at all. I think at one point they may get disconnected so that they can have a shower, or I can't remember if it just goes in with them anyway. They put a pillowcase over the bag to make it not as confronting for the person that's being refed. Anytime she needed to get out of bed, whether it was to go to the toilet or anything else, she either had to go in a pan or she had to go in a wheelchair. She was not able to stand up at all. By that time, her heart was so unwell that she was not able to stand up. And it wasn't until a lot later anyway that, I think about a year later, we reflected on this first journey in hospital, and she told us that at that point in time, she didn't have the energy to get up. She couldn't even get up. She would have soiled herself in bed because she no longer had any energy left in her body to be able to get herself up to go to the toilet. So every day, every morning for the 3 days, she's weighed in nothing but a hospital gown. And apparently the kids with eating disorders get pretty tricky with making their weight seem higher. So the hospital have had to come up with ways of making sure that 100% that there's no hiding of food or water or anything or heavy objects that can make their body seem heavier. Therefore, they're, ticked their criteria and then they can go home. So she had to have that every morning, first thing in the morning, and she also had to have a blood test every day to look at her blood levels. And I think my thoughts and feelings about this were, part of me at the time was just so relieved that she was in hospital and getting help, because I truly believe hospital can fix her. That's where she needs to be. But at the same time, I was so scared for her, because it is a very scary and confronting thing to see your child that weak that they can't get out of bed. The other stressful thing was as well that I have a full-time job. My husband worked away, and I've got 2 other daughters at home. So at that point in time for me, having my daughter in hospital on that 3-day feed, it was just a time of pure survival. You're in autopilot, just meeting the needs of the people around you, and that's it. I felt I was constantly on the verge of tears under the pressure and I suppose the overwhelming feeling, the theme that I had for the last 6 months was I felt like such a shitty parent that had just failed their kids. I mean, what kind of parent can't get their kid to eat? What kind of parent lets their kids have something like anorexia? I mean, it's all stupid thoughts, that you can't control any of that, but they're thoughts that go through your head at the time, or at least at one point in time, whether they're just fleeting through. It's just such an overwhelming feeling of failure as a parent, but at the same time, we're in fight mode to try and get her better. It was also so noisy on the ward that none of us got any sleep, so it just made like tensions and emotions fray even more because of the machines beeping and the nurses talking. By the way, they were talking on the children's ward, they were talking about the latest diets they were on a lot of the time, which to me was just really ludicrous. And I suppose, the sleep deprivation, to be honest, we hadn't slept in months anyway, leading up to the admission, so it wasn't anything new, but it's just, you're complete zombie land. You just don't know. You're just a zombie doing the actions that you need to do to keep your family well or keep your family running. So eventually there was a bed in the adolescent ward and we were able to get to go to that. The nurses on the adolescent ward are trained in eating disorders. They were trained in eating disorders. So we knew that, it wouldn't be a question of the nurses talking about their diets and things like that on this adolescent ward, because they had a lot of kids already on that ward with eating disorders, and the nurses were so good. They just knew what to do. So they're in a lot better place to help a kid with an eating disorder on the adolescent wards. Bear in mind, for us, this admission was still a medical admission because she hadn't been accepted by the eating disorder team. So we weren't getting eating disorder specific help on this admission. We were just getting re-nourishment from her body until we could be assessed by the eating disorder team, that, the one that we're on the wait list for, that we were never sick enough for, that list, so that service. When we moved to the adolescent ward, it really opened my eyes up to what we were in for as a parent of a child with an eating disorder. It was just horrific to see. There were lots of girls and 1 or 2 boys, all with nasogastric tubes in. So they have them in their nose, they go down into their stomach, and they get taped on their cheeks. So there's all these kids walking around with nasogastric tubes taped to their faces. And it's just devastating. You feel like your child's the only one, and then you go to a ward and you see a whole ward full of people that are exactly the same as your daughter. It's just crazy that there's not more support. A lot of the kids were wearing the same kind of clothes. So the nasogastric tubes, the same kind of clothes, loose, baggy tracksuit pants and hoodies. They all looked pale, withdrawn, and they also had this kind of weird united resolve to stay strong together. So they'd often come back from their meal times like with their arms around each other and in solidarity of the eating disorder, going, we're here for each other. Unfortunately, what you'll come to learn is that when people that are so unwell have an eating disorder and they're in a certain point in their recovery, then they don't help each other. They just make each other worse. It just feeds the eating disorder thoughts even more. So seeing that was just, on one hand, I was like, yay, they've got some people that are similar to them, but I soon learned that was the most destructive kind of relationship your child can have. So what I also noticed is they look the same as my daughter. The baggy clothes, the arguing, all the things that I thought were so specific to my daughter, I now found out were specific to kids with eating disorders. So anytime you think my daughter's very different, the only one that does this, have a think again, because there are certain characteristics of kids with eating disorders and teens with eating disorders that are common across most of them. Sure, there's outliers, but most of them have these common traits once they get to the stage where in the hospital. So they're pale, withdrawn, they'd hang around each other on the ward and become friends. And that was just, they taught each other how to stay on the path of anorexia. They were pacing, some of them were pacing around their rooms, and we found out that they're trying to get to over 20,000 steps a day. And they would track them by counting them because they didn't always have access to a phone or anything else to track them. So room after room, you looked around and you saw girls pacing and pacing and pacing. And sometimes if we had a joint room, you could hear the girl on the other side of the curtain huffing and puffing as they're trying to pace around their room or jog around their room, this tiny space. It was really, really eye-opening. And although pacing wasn't something that my daughter did at the time, she certainly learned on that admission that it was something that you could do, and it was one of the things that she picked up in subsequent admissions. In the ward, also on the adolescent ward, the toilets and the showers are locked. So the kids can't vomit after their meals, and all toileting and showers does take place before meals. So there's a very strict kind of routine there where, half an hour before a meal, the nurses would come around and unlock the toilets, so people could go to the toilet. And then even if they wanted to go to the toilet after their meal, they couldn't, because that was a major time for kids purging, if they wanted to vomit after their meals. So it was a really eye-opening and very confronting experience, as well as a really good sign of things, things that were to come for us. Another thing that we saw on the ward is that every single day you heard teenagers screaming hysterically as the hospital staff are trying to get them to eat, the same as what was happening for us at home. The screaming was also accompanied by massive anger and throwing objects all around the room. So this is, bear in mind, this is on a hospital ward. We saw a girl smash everything in her room. She even picked up a mattress and threw that against the window as well. She was that distressed and that distraught with the eating disorder thoughts and the thought of having to eat. So every single day we were there, we saw the cleaning staff coming in and out of the rooms, cleaning someone's room that had been destroyed, or that feeding formula had been thrown around the room or on the staff, or on the floor. So it was a very eye-opening process. And I do remember at the time, all I could think of was like, thank God my daughter is not that unwell. Thank God she is not doing that. I thought all she needed was a feed and to regain her weight, and then she would be okay. I'll just let you know now that eventually things did get like that. She was the one getting the codes called on her in the hospital. She was the one having the security guards hold her down to give her sedatives, or the booty juice, as the girls in the hospital also called it. So even though this admission, it wasn't like that at all. She was in bed most of the time feeding or getting refeeding. Those behaviours that I saw other girls do in that ward, my daughter certainly did in subsequent admissions. So after her 3-day feed, she went on a mealtime program that was 3 meals and 3 snacks a day. And if they didn't eat the meals or the snacks, then they had a supplement to either eat or drink through a nasogastric tube. So it was no surprise that just because she'd been on a nasogastric tube for 3 days, it wasn't going to make her eat still. There was still so much inspiration to stay true to the cause of the eating disorder, along with all of the other sick kids with anorexia that were in the hospital. So in terms of like being a parent in the hospital, once a day the medical staff would come around and do their rounds and give an update on anything that was going on. My idea is when she went in hospital, they'd be able to fix her, because the hospital is where sick people go to get better. And it was such a hard lesson to learn that all the hospital really can do is keep them alive and try to weight restore them until their brain hops out of starvation syndrome and they're more willing to take on information and they do want to get their life back. But that process alone can take several years. So our hospital stay, this hospital stay for us lasted about 4 weeks. And she came home to us still not eating any food. And I feel like the hospital has like an average length of stay. So as soon as you start to get to the end of whatever that time length is, the hospital staff feel really pressured to discharge you home. So as a parent, you feel a lot of pressure put on you towards that time for them to just get you home. And they know that they'll discharge you home and you'll be back anyway, but it seems to suit the hospital stats to have you out and then come back at a later date versus just staying in for that period of time. So even if the kids aren't eating at that particular point in time, they were force-fed, which I personally agree with because it kept my child alive, until they're medically stable. And then once they're medically stable, because my daughter wasn't a part of the eating disorder program, she just got shipped straight off home. And that's what happened to us. Before we were being discharged, I remember being so angry at the hospital and so scared to have her home. I wanted her to stay in hospital until she was fixed, but it didn't click until a couple of admissions later that the hospital can't cure a child from anorexia. In fact, no one can. Until they are weight restored and until they're willing to recover themselves, until they see something in their future worth living for, then all anyone can do is keep them alive up until that point in time. So that was a big lesson for us. And I feel like if I had have recognized that earlier on and come to more of an acceptance phase that this was our life at the time, things probably would have been a little bit easier for us. When we knew that this diagnosis was serious, and when the doctor told us that he thought our daughter was showing signs to be one of the trickier cases to treat, that was a real challenge for us. He said that kids with anorexia fall into 3 baskets. Some recover completely and go on to live normal lives in recovery. The second group go on to struggle with it and might struggle in and out of recovery forever. And the third group are completely consumed by the disease and really have, shockingly, a good chance of being totally consumed by it and potentially having dire consequences for their life. I don't know if you know this by now, but there is a really, anorexia and eating disorders have the highest mortality rate for any childhood mental illness. So it gets me upset when I think about that. That's a devastating thing to happen. So hearing that news from your doctor, thought that she would be trickier, and so it meant they thought that she might be in the 2nd or 3rd category for us, was extremely confronting. And it, to be honest, it scared the living shit out of us, out of my husband and I. So during that time, my husband and I decided that we would do everything humanly possible to keep our child in that first category that completely recovers from anorexia. And we knew we had to make dramatic changes to our lives that impacted on us very heavily. But at that meeting, we decided we would do every single thing that we could, every single thing that the medical staff told us, every single thing that the psychologists and her eating disorder recovery team told us to do, no matter what, no matter how hard it is, we were going to follow that advice to have this phase of our life pass as quickly as possible. So that was our resolve after that case and after that admission. And it was that decision right then and there that we changed our lives completely in terms of how we approached it and what we did to get our daughter into recovery. That was the single thing I think that has pulled us through it in minimum time, so that we're surprised even to this day of how far we've come in that time. But, we just, in our hearts, we made the promise that this is what we were going to do to get this over. We did not want this for her life, and we didn't want it for our lives either. So in hindsight, the first admission is purely a medical admission for weight restoration. It lasted about a month, and it really took the anorexia to the next level. We thought it'd be making it easier for us, and once she'd be in hospital, she'd be fixed. But it actually took it to the next level because she learned from the other kids all of those behaviors that help the anorexia stay longer and help those eating disorder thoughts become stronger and stronger. One of the good things to come out of that initial admission was that she did jump the queue for assessment into the eating disorder service at the hospital. So because she was so unwell, because the wait list, I should say, it's a priority as a needs-based thing. So you may ring up and the wait list is really long, but your daughter or your child might be a lot sicker than some of the other kids on the wait list. So it is a prioritized wait list. So when I say jump the queue, it just means that she was prioritized as very, very unwell, and so she got some service the service that she needed. So the eating disorder service took her in for an assessment, and that was booked for about 3 days after we got home from hospital. And after she had that assessment with the eating disorder service, she got accepted into the team, and we then were accepted to start therapy. Unfortunately, because she was discharged home not eating, which is very typical for a medical admission, and to be honest, now we know there's not much else the medical staff can do at that time. Unfortunately, a few days later, she was admitted back into hospital as she wasn't eating again, and the same health conditions came back. But what we've learned since is once they've discharged home, and it's happened once, they get to that point where they need help a lot quicker. So even though she'd weight restored a little bit, it didn't take long for that to really go, and it went within a couple of days. For us, the only saving grace was that she was under the care of the eating disorder service now, and she would get admitted into the eating disorder beds on the ward in all the subsequent admissions, which have a lot more specialist programs attached to them that we could have access to. So that was our first hospital admission, and it wasn't at all what I expected. Given that I expected the hospital to cure her, because that's where you go when you're sick. And it was an incredibly stressful time for our family. All of the other parents on the ward looked exactly the same as us, looked like a hot mess, just like us. Like they were holding their lives together by a single thread. And so on that front, it kind of made me feel like not alone. I saw other parents just like me, that kids had eating disorders. So I kind of felt like, all right, this is a thing that happens to a lot of people. I didn't feel so alone with that. During this admission, my parents looked after my other kids. So that's an important thing when you have a hospital admission, is to get all those support networks around you so that you're able to concentrate on where you need to. So in this instance, my parents, my husband, and also my husband's parents, they all helped us out, like immeasurably so, with looking after our kids, our other two that were home, and tried to make their lives as normal as possible while, mum and dad were often in the hospital all of the time. So that, having that support network was, around us was really, really vital at the time. So I hope you have learned a few things maybe from our first trip to hospital, knowing that it's a medical admission. I see a lot of parents online have the expectation that the only person that can fix their kids is the hospital, and our experience is it's truly not the case. All they can do is keep them alive until they're at a point in time where therapy can work. So it really becomes our role as parents to fix our child. And the sooner you can get to that conclusion, the quicker you can move forward in your journey in healing your family and healing your child from anorexia and an eating disorder. So that was our first hospital stay. It was eye-opening for us, not what was expected. And I hope that you've learned something from that can help you. Or maybe, you've got this coming down the track from you where your child is really sick, and you know that you're in the stage where we were and nothing is helping. You're just literally waiting for the time when they're sick enough to get support from hospital, and a hospital admission is, necessary. If your hospital admission was any different to ours, please put it in the comments, because we do want as much information to help parents as possible. Maybe what was one of your tips, or what did you learn when your child was in hospital? Or, what are you really struggling with now while you're waiting for your child to get access to services to have refeeding or anything like that? Let us know in the comments so that we can all help each other. Thank you so much for listening to our journey. It's therapeutic as much as it is for me. I know it's a learning experience for you, but this is also therapy for me, getting this all out of my system. And please join us in the next video when we're going to talk a little bit more about the first year of living with an eating disorder. Thanks very much. Stay strong, look after yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.